I realized that I needed to start leading myself more effectively. That if I could start to be more in tune with who I was, what my emotions were on a daily basis, how I viewed myself, where my self-confidence was strong, where it lacked, where I had personal clarity, where I didn't, that would put me in better position to interact with other people. And that's exactly what started to happen.
All right, let's just get into it. Why don't you start off by telling us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
My name is Raman Chadha, and I'm the founder of the Junto Institute. We are a leadership development organization that focuses on emotional intelligence, executive coaching, and team training.
All things that I think are absolutely necessary in where business is going. I think in the 21st century, we're switching to a new way of doing business. So I know that's going to be incredibly important. How did you get pointed in that direction? What happened that kind of steered your life in that direction?
Well, it was about 17 or 18 years ago, and I began studying emotional intelligence for my own benefit. My life was being transformed in ways that I didn't even know at the time. And then when I became conscious of it in ways that I had never imagined it could. My former career was as an educator. So I saw an opportunity to bring that type of learning to people in the business world, where I believe there is an enormous lack of attention given to personal growth that can actually have a benefit on professional outcomes. And so at the time, it was focused on early stage companies like startups. And over the course of time, we gradually evolved into later stage organizations, mid-sized groups.
So you started off kind of with smaller companies, I assume, just kind of people who are getting started starting in their company and they're trying to figure out how do they do people. Is that kind of what you mean with that? Or is it something beyond that?
Yeah, at the time it was more aligned with the transition that a lot of startup founders have to make, which is as their company is growing, they start to see that they're now running an organization. And so their role must transition from being a founder to becoming a leader. The struggle that a lot of people have in those roles is they don't necessarily know how to do that. And while there are plenty of leadership curricula and majors, especially in universities and structured programs, many of us believe that leadership is something that we don't necessarily can teach to people, but it can be learned. And so one of the tools, or one of the methodologies, I should say, that has been proven to be effective in learning leadership is emotional intelligence. And so that became a useful way for these founders to make that transition successfully.
Yeah, Simon Sinek talks a lot about that, how traditionally or conventionally in promoting leaders, we tend to look for people who are very good at their job and then kind of just assume that will make them a good leader of people, and how like those are two very different skill sets. It sounds like you would kind of say the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree.
What would you say kind of makes the main difference between those two types of skill sets?
The skill set between being good at one's job versus becoming good at being a leader. Just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, being good at leading people versus being technically expert.
Well, I think the simple difference is that one is technical and one is not. Another way of looking at it is one consists of hard skills, the other one consists of soft skills, or what were perceived as soft skills. And as like many of us used to say, in probably as recently as 5 to 7 years ago, although today you rarely hear it, it's really the soft skills that are hard. And so that becomes a challenge because in school, whatever type of school one is exposed to, whether it's elementary school or graduate school, soft skills, while they might be addressed, are very difficult to teach and to learn. And so therein lies the challenge. And anyone who has been in any form of deep relationship, whether it's a life relationship, a business relationship, a very dear friend, close friend, knows that it's not about technical or quote unquote hard skills. It's really about the people and the soft skills.
So you said you started learning this because you were pursuing that in your own life. Was there something that precipitated that, or was there anything that you're willing to share that kind of started you in the direction of learning this yourself and then giving it to other people?
Yeah, it was when I wanted to study leadership for my own benefit in my then role. Uh, I was running an entrepreneurship center at a large university. I wanted to become a better leader myself. Kept coming across this phrase of emotional intelligence, which I was somewhat familiar with, but could not describe perhaps to other people. And so I picked up the eponymous book on the subject by Daniel Goleman. And upon reading that, I started to get some answers to questions that I had been asking myself for quite some time. And so the deeper I got into that book, the deeper I got into the topic and went down that proverbial rabbit hole, which in this case was a beautiful rabbit hole because I was discovering things about myself, the world, the people in my life that I had never been aware of. And the beauty of it for someone like myself was that emotional intelligence is grounded in science. So it is not something that someone made up. It is not a belief system. It is not a philosophy. It is grounded in the brilliant work that social scientists like Daniel Goleman and his contemporaries did research in. But then over the last 20 years, it's also been bolstered by a whole lot of neuroscience research because of neuroimaging technologies that have emerged in these last couple of decades. And so that blend of serendipity, but then also an awareness and then the scientific grounding of it were the three elements that kind of came together that led me to pursuing this, not just for my work and for my vocation, but more importantly for my life.
And I love that you talked about like there's your work and your vocation, but it all starts with your life, like your own personal experience. And my wife and I like to say, you can't give what you don't have. And so, like looking into that experience, what would you say would have been the biggest change that you experienced in your life, in your relationships, in your work, like in your life between before you started this pursuit and after?
Um, like a lot of people, I used to wonder why people in my life were the way that they were. And why couldn't they be different? Why couldn't they say things differently? Why couldn't they behave differently? I knew that there were a lot of areas that I could grow in and that I could change and I could become better at. What I didn't realize is that it actually began with me first. And so the best way to describe it is in our work, we've structured our program in that regard. It's essential to first learn how to lead yourself before you get better at leading other people. And so, taking it out of the context of the workplace, even in life, we are leaders of ourselves and we are leaders of other people. One of my favorite phrases is that everyone is a leader and we are always a leader. And what I mean by that is in our friend group, we are a leader. In our household, we are a leader. In our community, we are a leader. The point being that there is no one leader, everyone is a leader, but it begins with ourselves. And so when we start to build self mastery through building greater self awareness and exercising greater self management skills, we start becoming more effective as a leader of ourself. That is then when we are in position to start paying attention to other people. And then we dive into the next two domains of emotional intelligence, which are social awareness and relationship management. And so going back to what I started with, I realized that I needed to start leading myself more effectively. That if I could start to be more in tune with who I was, what my emotions were on a daily basis, how I viewed myself, where my self-confidence was strong, where it lacked, where I had personal clarity, where I didn't, that would put me in better position to interact with other people. And that's exactly what started to happen. And it happened pretty fast. I began the journey at the age of 40, and it was probably within 4 or 5 years that I recognized there was a pretty significant change that had occurred. And at the time, it was a little bit of a struggle of, okay, now what do I do with this change? And that began then a process of adjusting the people that were in my life, changing the way that I interacted with the people who were in my life at the time, recognizing that I had a high internal locus of control that I wanted to tap into, and that I was not going to start talking about, or not start, but continue talking about my circumstances and my environment, which is external locus of control, but rather seizing as much control as I possibly could in order to design the path that I wanted to pursue going forward.
Can you talk a little bit more about that internal versus external locus of control, and like what you mean by it? And then, like, are you saying one is good, one is not? Like, what are you saying about those two things?
Yeah. So locus of control is a psychological construct. It is something that is studied by social scientists. And on one end of this continuum is internal locus of control. On the other end of the continuum is external locus of control. Neither one is good or bad. They just are. They're more like traits. Locus of control is a human trait. People who identify with or who score higher on internal locus of control, on scientifically backed instruments, are the types of people who believe that they can influence their outcomes in life. They take credit for their successes, and they also take blame for their failures and missteps. And so it comes from inside. That doesn't mean that they believe they have full control over everything in life. So an example I often use is a skier who lives near the mountains knows that bad weather can emerge at any point in time. That doesn't mean that that skier is going to drive into the bad weather and risk their life in the interest of getting on the slopes. They recognize that that's out of their control. Or they might recognize that on a day-to-day basis in their job, they can choose their tasks because they have autonomy. But if they have a boss that they report to, or a manager that tells them what to focus on, they must follow that. Otherwise, they're probably not going to maintain that job. And so the idea there is none of us is exclusively internal when it comes to locus of control, but we identify that or we test higher on those assessments. In contrast, people who identify with or score higher on external locus of control believe that their life outcomes are influenced by external factors. Luck, religion, other people, serendipity, chance. And so in those cases, they're the types of people who often will avoid taking credit for their successes and defer or assign blame for their failures or missteps to other factors. My boss is the reason why I don't like my job. My coworkers are giving me a hard time. I can never seem to catch a positive break. And so in those cases, again, no one is exclusively external locus of control, because someone can work really hard on their job, get a promotion, but then say, I did what I could, but I think I also got a little bit lucky. Or perhaps I believe in a higher force or a supreme being, or I follow a certain religion, and I might give credit there. And again, it's not bad, it's just how their mindset is. And so that's what we refer to when it comes to locus of control. And studies have shown that people can move from one end to the other. And especially people who have external control can gradually build a skill set in order to move further along the continuum, not all the way to the end, but further along the continuum. So they do believe that they exercise greater internal locus of control.
It's interesting that you're almost seeming to kind of like cut a line right in between how I've kind of typically looked at people where they tend to focus on their accomplishments and then blame others for their lack of accomplishments. And then the other side of it where people tend to people kind of tend to eschew credit but take on the blame. I like those. That's kind of the categories that I've seen people typically put others into those type of categories. It's interesting that you're kind of drawing a line right between them and saying, no, these are actually two different types of traits that people tend to do. Um, I know in myself, you talked about moving kind of from one to the other, and I grew up very much kind of external, what you seem to describe external locus of control, partly because of my upbringing and didn't have a whole lot of say, at least as I understood it in my life. And then I've really had to kind of like in my own life, I kind of considered a maturation of myself and beginning to own my future, my actions. But I'm not constantly running from things. I'm actually writing a book on fear right now, and when I was learning to essentially become rid of fear in your life and attune more to wisdom and prudence and that sort of thing, and how those are two different things. And when I lived in fear, it was very much an external. Everything is happening to me. I was constantly running from everything, constantly trying to get away from everything or fighting in order because I thought it was something coming against me. But as I've kind of shifted towards the other, it's more like I can affect this situation. I have some responsibility regardless of what happens. Like this is, regardless of whether I'm created this situation, I have something that I can do in it. And that's definitely been a huge part of the journey in me. And I can see where this might connect with what you were sharing the workshops. And I might be jumping ahead on the timeline a little bit, but this seems like it would be very much connected to helping people establish a sense of self, helping people establish a sense of purpose. Is this kind of connected to how you got into leading leading that workshop and then moving into where your business is at now?
No, in fact, as I look back at my life, I believe I have always aligned with high internal locus of control. I have designed my career. I have not been someone who relied on other people a whole lot in doing that. And more than anything, it's that it fits within the construct of emotional intelligence, because when we build this personal clarity, and I define clarity as mainly two things: values and purpose. When we are able to articulate our clarity, we are able to tap into our internal locus of control. Because the power that personal values have and the power that a personal purpose has is it gives us direction. It allows us to identify what's important to us, why we exist, and how we make decisions. Not how we want to make decisions or how we want to exist, but how we do make decisions and why we do exist. When we have that clarity, it becomes a nurturing force for tapping into that internal locus of control. Because, for instance, if one of my values is to engage in meaningful discourse and conversation where I can grow from a interaction, but I can also help someone else grow, that then helps define my friendships. And so now, as I think about internal locus of control, I may decide that I have friends who are unable or unwilling to follow that mindset, that model, and then instead choose friends and friendships that do. And so now I'm effectively influencing my own life outcomes, as opposed to then falling prey to, gosh, my friends aren't the types of people that I want in my life. It's because of my friends that I am not able to emerge from my past self into my future self, and falling into that pitfall of external locus of control.
It's interesting. So you talked about values and purpose, and at first I thought I knew exactly what you meant, and I think we still I still have a sense of it. But you brought up some values about I I value this type of relationship where this type of thing, this type of dynamic can emerge. Could you clarify a little bit? Clarify a little bit about what you mean exactly. Like, how do you define purpose, and how do you define values?
Mhm. So I define purpose as where you derive meaning in your life and why you believe you exist at this moment in your life. The reason I emphasize that last part is because our purpose can change over the course of our lifetime. I'm in my mid 50s. I have two grown children. My purpose today is different than it was 20 years ago when they were young children. My purpose was very much tied into being an active parent. Today, I'm still an active parent, but I'm not as active of a parent as I was then because both my children are independent. They're able to support themselves. They're adjusting to their new world of being young adults, so on and so forth. There are different elements to my purpose than just being a parent, but that's one small example. I define values as those things that are important to us and how we make decisions. So one of my values, as I said earlier, was engaging in meaningful discourse with people as a means for building relationships. Another one of my values is creating memories through fresh, unique experiences for both myself and other people. That's how I make decisions today. Right? And so with my friends, for instance, and even with my partner, I'm doing this all the time. Constantly thinking about the following weekend, the following month, later this year, and designing experiences for both myself and them with the intent of creating memories. Not just having fun, but creating memories. And so that's what's important to me because I know that when I leave this world, all I will take with me in those last moments of consciousness are my memories. And I want to influence them as much as I possibly can. I also believe that that's how most human beings are likely going to leave their last moments of consciousness. And so that's why it influences that value. Is that helpful?
So you would say that your purpose is like the focus, I would say the intentional focus of your life right now. And then your values seem to be how you engage in that focus.
They could be. So not all of my values support my purpose. My purpose statement is to grow and flourish so I can help other people do the same. That's my purpose statement. That is supported by a 7-paragraph mission statement that goes into detail in different aspects of my life. But not all my values are in support of that. Many of them are, but not
So
all of them.
so it's a little bit more of like an X and Y axis of your life of like kind of this is if someone were to kind of get a sense of who you are, they could kind of put your purpose and your values together and get a little bit of a picture of who you are.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, nice. I'd love to circle back to that if we have time. What is like? How did we get? Like, how did you get from leading those groups on emotional intelligence to you mentioned you started leading a group in our previous conversation. You started leading the meetup group, and then you started leading some workshops. Like, how did that story happen to get you where you are today?
That's those workshops, of which I've only done 2 so far, are an outcome of my work.
Okay.
We do a lot of corporate training, and
Hmm.
we've done thousands of sessions in the last 12 years, probably over 3,000 sessions. So that's a normal course of my work. One very small piece of the emotional intelligence framework is personal clarity. And so I've done a couple of small workshops for like an hour and a half to 2 hours each, just because that topic has come up over and over again in the course of day-to-day conversation. And so that was what led to those workshops.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. I can definitely see it's not something I personally believe it's one of my passions, like helping people understand like what's inside them and helping them get to the point where they're able to live with clarity, as you talk about. But it's definitely not something I see discussed a lot in the public sphere. I see certain things about leadership and emotional intelligence, which are coming up, and it's beautiful, amazing. I'm especially veteran background, like um, you encountered a lot of leaders, technical leaders, but emotional intelligence was kind of left to the wayside, and it's only starting now to come in. So absolutely amazingly important and needed. But you definitely don't see a whole lot of what is your purpose in life? What's your clarity? What are your values? And you mentioned just kind of offhand a 7-page values, or 7-page, was it missions? Not mission statement.
7-paragraph mission statement. Yeah.
7-paragraph mission statement. You definitely don't see people getting into it that deep, in my experience. But this is something that you have your people do as a part of your course, as a part of your coaching.
Yeah, and we don't necessarily tell them to write up 7 paragraphs for their mission statement, but one of the exercises to discover one's purpose is to write a mission statement. Right, so it's a useful exercise if someone is trying to figure out what is my purpose. One of the best frameworks I've ever seen for writing a personal mission statement comes from the book 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. Another useful exercise for purpose is to write out one's eulogy or obituary. I like eulogy as opposed to obituary because a eulogy is delivered by someone else. And most of the time, there are multiple someone else's. So if you've ever been to a service for someone who has passed, perhaps it's their partner, their children, their business colleagues, whomever it might be, their neighbors. Multiple people deliver multiple eulogies. And so the beauty of a eulogy is we get to see someone through different lenses, versus an obituary tends to be very objective and factual. Right? Raman was an active member of his community. He went to this university. This is what his career was about. It doesn't really share much about the human being.
It's a little more than a headstone in a way.
Yeah, exactly. So the eulogy can be a useful useful exercise to think about, what would people say about me? And not 10, 20, 50 years from now. I like to offer the layer of 3 to 5 years from now. Right? So if you passed away 3 to 5 years from now, what would you want people to say about you? What language do you want them to use? What stories do you want them to tell? What memories do you want them to share? Because then it becomes a little bit more actionable. If that's what I want them to say, how can I start living that way today? And so it can be another way to fuel purpose. And then finally, a third exercise that we like to suggest is called the Odyssey Plan, which was crafted by the 2 founders of Stanford's design school. And so it's a way to see how your life might change in the next 3 to 5 years, and then for you to be able to respond to that. How do I feel about my life changing in those ways? If I decide to move, if I decide to change jobs, if I decide to cement this life partnership with someone, so on and so forth. So those are different ways that we can engage in finding or discovering our purpose.
I love how you brought up those 2 different exercises for a specific reason. You talked about having someone have a very conscious writing down the things that they want to see in their life, the eulogy that they want to have, essentially the impact on the people around them and the world around them that they want to have in the next 3 to 5 years. And then I love that you also brought in the other part of it, because how do you feel about those changes? It's essentially bringing in the heart, bringing in the unconscious, and letting someone experience that. I feel like that's important for multiple reasons. One, because it's much more, it kind of prepares people for those changes, because if someone writes down a goal that requires them, or an impact or whatever, that requires them to pick up their life and change it in a big way, and then they weren't emotionally prepared for that, that can be a big hiccup. But then there's the other side of it, where you are essentially inviting someone into visualizing what their life is going to be like. And that not only helps get their heart on board, that actually helps to kind of reorient their life truly in that direction, rather than just putting down an intellectual goal, but inviting them to experience it through their imagination. How would I feel? How would I? A lot of the coaching that I've seen in helping people like turn their life around has to do with that visualization and allowing someone to really feel that goal. So through these two different exercises, it really seems like you are in helping someone kind of pick up and reorient their life on an entirely new trajectory by bringing in both the mind and the heart. Did you say that's accurate to your experience?
Yeah, that's aligned with what I've been through and with what we talk about in building greater personal clarity. Because the idea of personal clarity, if we go back to this notion of emotional intelligence as being the core of it, part of emotional intelligence is exercising self-management. Why do we want to exercise self-management? To tap into our internal locus of control so we could design the life that we want. Most of us want to experience positive emotions. And so when we have personal clarity, we are more inclined to experience positive emotions because we're moving in the direction that we want to go. And that becomes very powerful. Because I don't know about you, but I don't want to experience negative emotions. I know there are
It
times
becomes
in life.
reinforcing in a way, like you start to pick up momentum because you have imagined that, and then as you start experiencing it, it reinforces that and builds your momentum in that direction.
Yeah. And emotions aren't just an outcome of our experiences, they're actually a driver of almost all of our thoughts and behaviors. Neuroscience has proven that in the last 20 years. Our emotions effectively dictate the way that we think and our behaviors and our actions and our motivations. And so they're a very powerful force that only in the last 15 to 20 years, science has been able to identify. And so if I can tap into positive emotions as a motivating factor right now for the rest of my day, I'm also likely to experience positive emotions during the rest of the day. And it becomes this beautifully virtuous cycle. And it helps explain why some people who do identify with a high internal locus of control, not some people, the vast majority of people who do identify with higher internal locus of control report higher levels of life satisfaction, higher levels of happiness and contentment, stronger and healthier relationships, better overall physical, mental, spiritual, and emotional health. And the list goes on and on and on. And a lot of it is because positive emotions are a driver and positive emotions are an outcome.
Would you say that it's because positive emotions reflect what your inner world is more accurately? And so if you're able to align those things in a certain direction, then what you believe subconsciously is also in line with what you're trying to do consciously?
It could be. It could be. Recent studies, maybe in the last like 8 to 10 years, maybe even shorter than that, maybe the last 4 to 8 years, have increasingly been finding that people can choose their emotions. And so even in times of hardship, there have been studies that have shown that some people can actually choose a positive emotion or a group of positive emotions in response to that hardship. Um, Again, a lot of it goes back to some of the kind of core tenets of what's called good health, right? We're familiar with the holy trinity of diet, sleep, and exercise. When we're taking care of ourselves and our bodies, because that's where everything begins, right? In this physical world, that's the manifestation of life, is our body. When we are taking care of our body and what we put into it, we're taking care of our body in the form of movement, or taking care of our body in the form of rest. Those help provide a foundation. And a very simple yet fun way of remembering that is many people are familiar with what are called the happy chemicals: dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphins. And a simple way to remember that is every day I want a dose of happy chemicals. If I am doing things or eating foods or being with people that help drive those happy chemicals on a daily basis, much of which, by the way, is driven, if not all, by diet, sleep, and exercise, I'm setting myself for happy chemicals. I've got neurotransmitters and hormones that are healthy for me to be flowing through my body. And so I just feel better overall. And therefore, I believe that I can influence my outcomes in life. And there, that cycle gets accelerated.
So let's imagine someone is in a place where they are looking to find clarity, looking to make some of those changes. If you, trying to honor the way that you phrased earlier, if you were in that position right now and watching this show, what are some things that you could start with in the moment? And then maybe we can get into later, like what are some more long-term changes? But what are some things right now that someone might, questions they might ask, things they might try out, exercises, resources, whatever? Like what would you do if you were in their position right now?
Yeah. So going back to how I define clarity, two things, values and purpose. I already shared a couple of different exercises that can be done on the purpose side. On the values side, one of the biggest mistakes that I used to make and that I've seen so many people make is describing their values with single words: growth, love, health, wealth, adventure. But every one of those words means something different to every single person. So I'm a big believer in crafting sentences and paragraphs inspired by those words. What does growth mean to you? For example, I used to define growth as continuing to learn and consuming more information and wisdom through books, podcasts, blogs, and so forth. Today, I define growth very differently because I realized that I was already doing all of those things just second nature. Now I define growth as I only spend time, and I emphasize the word only, I only spend time with people whom I can help grow and who can help me grow. Now it's different. And I have put that in the form of a sentence, right? I already shared the way that I define adventure earlier, creating experiences that develop memories for people. So the whole idea there is to start with a list of words. And by the way, there's a lot of lists out there. Brene Brown, in one of her recent books, produced a list of something like 70 to 100 words that reflect common values. Start with that list. Choose 10 to 15 words that seem to resonate. And then do what I did, which was I wrote out sentences and paragraphs to define what that word meant to me. And so today I literally have 14 core values. And I spent about 4 years, I'm going to say, just before COVID hit, and then through the subsequent few years where I was reviewing and revisiting those values almost on a daily basis. It was part of my morning routine. They
Programming.
they seeped into my subconsciousness, and they just became then a part of my being. Today, I look at my core values maybe 2 to 3 times a year because I'm living them out on a consistent basis. Just recently, I started thinking about a 15th core value. I'm not quite sure yet whether I'm going to incorporate that, but it's something that I'm exploring. And so the point being that both our values and our purpose reflect where we are at our current stage of life. Right? Our values change, and so does our purpose. And that's why sometimes people go in and out of personal clarity just based on what stage of life they're at. And so those are times where we can stop and say, okay, time for me to revisit those values and purpose statements to reflect where I am now.
Do you think it's possible for someone to orient them such a way with clarity that it grows with them, or do they have to keep going back and revising?
I'll just go back to what I said about clarity, that our values and our purpose change over the course of time, sometimes in response to the idea that we are lacking clarity and we need more clarity, other times to simply reflect where we are in life. So I'm, in middle life. I'm in my mid 50s, and I come across people periodically who have moved away from their hometown or where they raised their family, or people who've gotten divorced, or people whose children with whom they were very close have left the nest. And all of a sudden they're like, what do I do? Who am I? The way, my identity was associated with being a parent. My kids are grown up, they're gone. Or I was very close with my former spouse. How do I define this new and design this new path that I'm moving forward on? In moments like that, someone who did have a lot of clarity might all of a sudden be struggling with it. That's where something like this can be useful.
So, do you ever help someone kind of identify the end goal of like the long 20, 30-year impact? I know you said you focus primarily on the 3 to 5 because it sounded like you're really helping someone reorient and get that initial process. But say someone's been on this journey for a while and they're trying to figure out like what is in them that they can give to the world when they're gone. The way that I kind of define maybe legacy or something that it stays with the world after you depart. Do you ever help someone kind of figure that out about themselves, or is that kind of outside of your purview?
No, that could be a part of the work that we do together. That would be a part of the purpose work. Right? So some people have a purpose that's aligned with legacy. Many people don't. I can't tell you how many people I've worked with who've said, my purpose is to be the best possible parent, best possible spouse, best possible best friend. And that they may define their legacy that way, they may not. Right? So legacy is more a choice that some people make, as opposed to a standard that everyone has. But for me, it's aligned with purpose.
Okay. So I think that I was going to ask, you shared a couple exercises that someone could do right now. We addressed that a little bit with the question about long-term and purpose and all that. But say someone has done those exercises, they've done the work of going through the words and writing out the sentences and the paragraphs. What might be next for them? Like, how do they begin to orient their life in that direction? What would you say?
Well, hopefully, if the values reflect how they make decisions now, that becomes a guiding light for them as well. So the reason that I used to review my values on a daily basis, almost on a daily basis, I'd say probably 300 days of the year, I would look at my values in the morning. Because what it did then is reminded me of how I was able to make decisions and not fall back into my old patterns of behavior. So what happens if they're written well and they truly reflect how you make decisions and what you deem important, is they are likely just going to automatically influence the decisions that you make later today, the next day, and so forth.
Okay, makes sense. I have a slightly different question that has more to do with kind of you and people like you and someone who works in a similar field as you do. You talked about emotional intelligence, leadership coaching, executive coaching, and helping people find clarity, all of that. Where do you think that you kind of, or I should say that type of work kind of fits in line with, we talked about kind of breaking down silos between different areas of wellness. Are there certain other areas that your work might work well with if someone were to kind of like, I need to do physical therapy and clarity work, or is there other types of practitioners who might be a good partner for this type of work that someone would be able to help their people reach a next level by kind of partnering with those?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. I will share like what I believe in, and that if I were to collaborate with others, my beliefs would influence that pursuit. Uh, I'm I'm a big believer in science, and the work that I've done and I will continue to do must have some scientific grounding. There's proof, there's evidence there that the methodology, the process, the system, the framework can actually work. A second thing is that it's future oriented and growth oriented. So, emotional intelligence comes from the branch of psychology that is called positive psychology because it is about human flourishing. Emotional intelligence is viewed as a virtuous human trait, and it allows us to tap into our potential both today and in the future. And so, as an example, I don't have a clinical background. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a counselor. I'm not certified in those fields. And so, when someone poses a question to me, why am I doing this? Why am I doing that? I'm not equipped to, first of all, respond. Secondly, most importantly, don't know how to ask the right types of questions. But when someone says, I know I've got potential in me and this is who I'd like to become, that is more aligned with my capacity, my skill set, my certifications, my knowledge, my experience. So those two factors are what I would probably use as parameters to define the types of practitioners that I might be aligned with. Are they future oriented, and do they see science as a necessary foundation in the work that we might do?
Okay. So that sounds like those would be the type of people who would work well with you, those who value and have kind of oriented themselves, or I should say, have built their work with the same kind of type of clarity, not to use that term too loosely, but methodology as the scientifically minded and those pursuits and grounding it, and then also having it future oriented, um, positive positive movement, growth oriented. I think those are like really two good. Like you said, they're people who would work well with you as a person, as a practitioner in this type of work. If I might also just suggest, it sounds like someone who someone who works in the psychological field, to help someone, might walk alongside you really well, and then perhaps someone who works in the social field, because it sounds like a lot of what you do is helping people establish a positive impact on the people around them. And it sounds like perhaps those two fields would work well with your kind of purpose and values clarity oriented work. Did you say that would be accurate?
Yes, I'll just add one thing is that because psychology is such a broad category of social science, that it's on the positive psychology, on the future oriented. Because a kind of a conventional psychologist can deal with both someone's past and someone's future. And so in my case, it is more aligned with that branch that is more focused on the future.
So say someone who has already kind of done a little bit of the work of letting go of their past, for example, and is now trying to establish a better future is kind of where your focus is more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, even as someone who's oriented in that way, I won't say that I've let go of my past. I'm just not anchored by my past.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's not what I lean into on a day-to-day basis. I'm very aware, very conscious of my past. Uh, what I'm focused on is, and you use the analogy earlier, and it can be used in this context too. I'm not trying to run away from something. I'm trying to run towards something. But people who are growth oriented are doing that, running towards something.
So we talked a little bit about what someone might uh, what someone might be experiencing, what they may do in order to kind of enter into this type of care, or I should say, like how this period of life where they start reorienting themselves and getting clarity about their life. What How would you describe a graduate from your program, system, coaching? Like, what would that person look like in their own life? That they've you're at the point where you say, okay, you can fly. You have metamorphosized, if that's the right word, and like fly on without me. Like, what would that person look like in their own life?
Well, there's the graduated, there's the definition of graduated, that is that they've completed a program or they've completed a segment of coaching sessions, right? Um, but then there's also the definition of graduated, which is it never happens. In other words, I believe that these types of journeys, growth journeys, are just that. They are directions and journeys. They are not destinations. Um, One area that I've been doing a lot of work in recently is in self-actualization. And that's a classic example. When people hear that phrase, self-actualization, they a lot of times infer that it is a destination. I'm now self-actualized. That's like saying I'm now emotionally intelligent. Okay, now what? And one of my favorite phrases is, it doesn't matter how emotionally intelligent you are. What matters is how emotionally intelligent you can become. I've been studying, practicing, teaching, coaching emotional intelligence now for almost 17 years. I'm never going to stop. I have no clue of how emotionally intelligent I can become, and that's why I keep working on it. The same thing goes with any form of personal growth, regardless of the discipline or methodology. We never get there. And so no one ever truly graduates. And so while they might finish the work that we do together and they might go out on their own, what I'm hoping is that's at a point where they believe they can do it all on their own. And some people can, some people can't, which is also a reason why some people stay with their therapist or counselor for many, many, many years, despite how well they're doing in their life and in their career and all the things that matter to them. So it's really a matter of personal preference. But to speak directly to your question, yeah, when it comes to growth and development and learning, we're never going to be able to get to everything.
My wife and I have this phrase that our background is a little bit more in helping people heal from trauma or heal from spiritual wounds or heal and get from a place of suffering to a place of at least feeling neutral, and if not working towards the future and getting better. Not that that's everything that we do, but that's been a lot of our history and the people that we've worked with, and including our own journey. And we kind of like to describe it as finding your stride, where you're out for a run and you get to a point. It's not like the run is over, but you found a point where you can keep this stride and still and do other things. Like, this doesn't have to be your focus, because it's now just a part of your life, and you're able to do it. You're able to maintain that pace as you're doing other things in your life and all that. Would you describe it as a similar way?
Mm-hmm. It becomes a part of the lifestyle. So part of my lifestyle is growth and flourishing. It's a standard I've set. It's a priority I have. When I say priority, I mean the literal definition of that word. One of a few things that you apply your full attention and focus on a consistent daily basis in your life. And so that's where it becomes almost second nature. I've got to lean into it. There are days where I can't devote attention to it. There might be a week here and there where I can't devote attention to it. But do I ever give it up? No. It's very similar to the idea of trying to become physically fit. There are people who go to the gym 4 to 7 times a week. They don't go every single day. They can't make it every single time, but they pay attention to it. They know that physical fitness is not an end point. It's a pursuit. It's a direction. Why don't we apply the exact same attributes to our psychological fitness and our emotional fitness? Right? They're just as important, if not more important. And the reason is because our physical fitness can't always help our emotional and psychological fitness. It can in a lot of cases, but our emotional and our psychological fitness almost always helps our physical fitness. And we know that because
In a
science has
way,
shown that our mind controls our body more than our body controls our mind.
it's thinking of it not so much as acquiring skills as much as staying sharp. Like you're going to be using these skills every day. And to apply that analogy, like if you use a knife every day, it doesn't stay sharp. It gets used, and you have to keep applying the whetstone, keep sharpening it, just like you would keep going to the gym.
Yep.
Speaking of whetstones, have there been have there been resources that you have found in your own journey or in helping other people that you frequently recommend to other people
Mm-hmm.
who are on their journey?
Yeah. I have some standards of my own, items that I go back to regularly and that I share with a lot of people. Several books in particular. One of them is what I already mentioned, Seven Habits of Highly Effective People. Speaking of sharpening your saw, anyone who's read that knows that it is it is number 7. There's also Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, which is an incredible book that relates to life purpose, mission statements, and obviously finding meaning in life. Another classic is How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. Almost 100 years old, I think, that is still relevant and read by a lot of young people today. And then finally, one that a lot of people aren't familiar with, which is one of my favorites of all time. And it really had a big impact on changing my life. And that is How Adam Smith Can Change Your Life. That's the name of the book. It's by Russell Roberts. Are you okay if I tell a little bit about the book? So a lot of people, especially in the West, in the US, know Adam Smith as being the father of capitalism. What they don't know is that Adam Smith, I think it was 20 or 30 years before he published The Wealth of Nations, which kind of started capitalism. Before he published that, he wrote a book called The Moral Sentiments, which had nothing to do with economics, capitalism, or money. It was all about humanity and core human tenets. And in fact, Adam Smith was a sociologist before he was an economist. And so centuries later, Russell Roberts, who is a modern day economist, discovered this book called The Moral Sentiments. And he wrote a book about Adam Smith's book. And so Russell Roberts' book, which is called How Adam Smith Can Change Your Life, is about different passages from Smith's book that relate to our modern world. And very simply, if there's one way that I might be able to define or describe the book, it is, as human beings, almost all of us want to be loved. And Adam Smith's path towards being loved is to be lovely. And Brett, you and I have exchanged a few emails, and I don't know if you saw it, but that is my salutation to my email, my outgoing greeting, is rather than saying best regards or warmly, it says be lovely. And there's a link to an article that I wrote because that book had such a transcendent effect on my life. And it was aligned with my journey with emotional intelligence that is how I've memorialized it. And it will stay that way until I'm no longer sending emails.
Wow. Golden recommendation by you for that book. I'll have to go check it out.
I hope
Thank
you
you.
do. Mm-hmm.
Are you currently accepting clients? And if so, where would someone go to look up your website,
Mhm.
to find you?
Yeah, so a couple places. One is my company's website is thejuntoinstitute.com, and Junto is spelled Junto. So thejuntoinstitute.com is the website where you can get an overview of the services that we offer. And I also have a Substack called Setting Standards, where I write about that whole topic, especially in the context of a lot of the topics that you and I have talked about here today. And I'm also on LinkedIn. So different ways to connect with me and the work that we do.
All right. Thank you so much for being with us, Raman.
Mm-hmm. My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Brett.